What's up, everybody? With the release of Live 10, we've got new devices, new workflows, and new power features. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use all these new capabilities to work with drum loops. You're going to learn how to really beef up and process your drums, getting them tight, punchy, in your face, and cutting through your mix. Here's our game plan. We'll start off by going over how to figure out the pitch of your drums so you know if they're in key with your track. Then how to repitch your drums if you need to get them into the exact frequency range that you want. We're going to talk about how to tighten up your drums, getting rid of unwanted things like long decays and room noise. Then we're going to get hands-on with a push-to controller. I'm going to show you exactly how I use that device to really quickly edit individual drum slices. Next up, we are going to talk about how I separate my drums and then combine them into multiple buses, getting them ready for processing. And we're going to wrap up with the exact audio effects and settings that I use to process my kick, snare, hi-hats, and then the drum bus as a whole. This is going to be a super comprehensive tutorial going through my entire workflow step by step and in depth. So just a heads up that this is going to be a longer tutorial. So grab a coffee, grab a tea, a glass of whiskey, whatever perks up your neurons, and let's do this. I'll start things off by showing you the before and after. So here's the original drum loop that I started out with. And then here is everything processed in context in the actual song. I'll just start it a few bars before so you can hear when the drums kick in. The first thing we're going to do is determine the pitch of the drums. And I like to use the snare for this because it has the most easily identifiable pitch peak, which is the fundamental of the drum. So we are going to put the original loop on solo. I'm going to select it and then press the Z key. And that's going to use one of Live 10's new features, which is zoom to selection. So I can press the Z key and that gets me zoomed in so I can perfectly see what I'm doing. And in order to figure out the pitch of the drums, we're going to use an audio device, an effect here called Spectrum, which is a spectrum analyzer. First thing I'm going to do is find the snare. So if we play through the loop, we can see that the snare is right there. I'm going to highlight just the snare, press the Z key again, and now I'm zoomed right into where the snare is. I'm going to tighten up my selection a little bit. Now, one of the other handy keyboard shortcuts, if you just want to hear one slice of this loop, is to highlight that particular area of the clip, hold down the Option key on OS X or the Alt key on PC, and then simultaneously press the spacebar, and that'll just play the region that you have selected. Now that's particularly important when you're using a spectrum analyzer because if you get a hat or a kick drum that plays directly after that, that's going to mess up the reading and you won't be able to easily see what the actual fundamental and frequency of your drum is. So let's go ahead and expand the spectrum analyzer so that it's full screen. And I'm going to hold down the Option key and press the space bar. And now you're able to actually see a very defined pitch peak here. And if I hover my mouse over the peak of it, you can see in the bottom left corner a readout of 221 hertz, which is indicating an A2. So A2 is actually 220 hertz. So that's very, very close to an A. And that is the pitch that I'm going to use to assess the drums. Now I want to repitch the drum loop because the song that I want to write is in G. I'm going to write in G minor. And so I want the drums to be repitched. Let's collapse the spectrum. And what I've done is created a step 2. So I've already gone through and warped the loop because the song that I want to write is actually in 70 BPM. So you can see here that I've gone and put in warp markers, warped the loop. I'm using beats mode. And then what I've done is transposed the drums down by 2 semitones. So we go from A to A flat to G, and that gets me into the key that I want to write in. Now, usually how I pitch my drums actually is using a frequency shifter. If I'm pitching an individual drum, then the frequency shifter is really, really clean. But in this case, I want to pitch the entire loop and I wanted to do it quickly. And I actually don't mind losing a little bit of fidelity because the style of drum sound that I want in this track is actually kind of lo-fi. So I pitched it globally down by 2 semitones. And now you can hear what it sounds like warped and pitched. Next, what I'm going to do is tighten up the drums. You can hear in the original loop that there's a lot of reverb, a lot of room sound, and a lot of decay on the drums because they're kind of jazzy, bluesy drums. They're not tight, punchy electronic drums yet. So listen for that stuff. I'm just going to play it one more time. You can especially hear it on the reverb, and you can hear all the drums have some decay on them. So what I'm going to do is use a gate. I've created another copy of the track, and I've put a gate device, and I've left all of the settings on it default. I've just changed the threshold. So let's listen to this without the gate, and then I'll activate it. So you can hear immediately the effect that it's having. It's tightening everything up. It's cutting off those longer decays on the drums, and it's getting rid of that unwanted room sound. It's just giving it much more of a choppy feel. And in general, that's what I really like to do with my drums. Now it's time to slice things up so that we can use the push-to controller. Before I do that, I'm actually going to render this track. So I'm going to take the gated loop. I'm going to use freeze track, and then I'm going to create a duplicate of it so that I can freeze the duplicate, leave the original. So if I want to ever go back to it, I can. And I'm going to flatten that. So you can now see the audio difference between the original drum track and the new drum track. Okay. So once I have everything flattened down, I'm going to use the slice to new MIDI track. So you right click on the clip, and you have a variety of different options. Now, you might think because these are drums, you're going to go convert drums to a new MIDI track. And what that'll do is actually just read the timing of the drums and then load a completely different drum rack with synth drums in it. That's not what I want. I want the original drum sounds. I just want them sliced up and put into a drum rack so I can play with them. So I'm going to use the top option here, slice to new MIDI track. Now, as soon as I press that, I'm going to get some options. And under here, you can choose a lot of different slicing techniques. And what I'm going to actually use in this case is transient, because Ableton Live's transient detection is going to definitely read a transient at the beginning of each little drum, hi-hat, tom, kick, snare, all of them. And that's how I want them sliced. Now, I could manually go into the loop and put in warp markers if I wanted to specify exactly where it was going to slice. But in this case, Ableton Live's transient detection is really good, and it's a very, very clear transient on each one of the drums. So I'm going to pick transient, and then I'm going to go OK. That's now created this track directly underneath with the same name, but you can see this is a MIDI track, and on it we have a whole bunch of MIDI notes. This is following the original drum pattern. What I do with it from here is then I can program my own drum pattern if I want to. I'm just going to go ahead and delete this track because I've already done that, and I've created a duplicate called sliced to MIDI. You can see I've edited the MIDI, and I have my own pattern in here, and I've changed the loop just a little bit. Okay, great. Now what I want to show you is how to edit things, the individual slices, with the push-to controller. So if we take a look at the push controller, you'll see that the drum pads have loaded with the individual slices, and I can just press and trigger them. I've already gone ahead and color-coded the drums so that kicks are red, snares and rim shots are orange, and hi-hats are yellow. Now, very simply, what I use the push for is just trimming the slices. It's really common when you slice up a loop for there to be little clicks and pops at the beginning, and little things like slicing artifacts. So what I do is I use the push's hands-on and visual control to be able to do that really, really quickly. I could do that with the mouse and keyboard, but I actually find that I'm quite a bit faster and I like it more. It's more enjoyable as a workflow to do it on the push. So what I need to do is select a sample. We'll start with the kick. And then I need to look at the actual waveform. So I'm going to press here so I can see it in the simpler. And all I do is I use the rotary encoders at the top of the push to trim the start and the end points, like this. So you can see at that point, I'm getting a little bit of the hi-hat just before the kick. And over here, I'm missing the body and the transient of the kick. But right there is a sweet spot. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the end point. And you can see as I move to the right, I begin to get a little bit of the hi-hat in the drum loop, and you get a click at the end. So I'm going to move it back over. And the final thing that I'll typically adjust is the fade out, using this encoder right here. And depending on the actual slice, usually I find around 5 milliseconds is a good spot. 5 to 10 milliseconds of a little fade out. Could be more if you have a click at the end. But I usually just adjust the start point, the end point, and then a little bit of fade out if I need to. And I've gone through and done this on all the drums, so you can hear. There's the rim shot. You can actually hear that hi-hat has a little click at the end. And you can see that's because there's another drum hot on its heels. So let's actually trim the end point of that a little bit. Good, there we go. So that's my workflow in Push. I literally just fire up all the drums. If I want to see all of the drums, I can also use this layout mode and go to drums 64 pads. Then I can see all of my drums in the drum rack all vertically like that. And if I have more than 16 drum slices in the drum rack, this is really, really useful. So the Push controller is fantastic for this. It's visual, it's hands-on, and I find it super, super fast. So that's my workflow. Now, before we get into processing the drums, it's really important to route things into buses together to prepare for the processing. Because I have a lot of different slices of the same drum, they're just different articulations and different recordings of it. Like the hi-hats here, you can see I have 5. Then what I want to do is group those together. And inside drum racks, it's got some hyper powerful internal busing. And this is one of the things that I love about Ableton Live, because in other programs, oftentimes you need to take up a bunch of audio tracks and bus them together, and it's a lot more convoluted. This is seamless and all within the drum rack. So let me show you what I've done here, because I've already bussed everything together. So if we show our chains, you can see that I've created an internal bus, which is a nested drum rack. And I'll show you how to do that in 1 second. And that contains all of the hi-hats, like so. I have 2 rim shots, and I am processing them differently, actually, and that's why they are outside of a nested drum rack or a bus. I have a single tom, and then I have a lot of different kicks. And again, I'm applying the same processing to all of the kicks, and that's why it makes sense to bus them together. So how I've done that, let's pretend that I wanted to bus the 2 rim shots together. I would multi-select them by holding down Shift and clicking on both. And then you can either right-click and go group, or you can see there's a keyboard shortcut there, Command G. And what that does is creates what's called a nested drum rack. It's a drum rack inside a drum rack, kind of like the movie Inception, a dream within a dream. You can go really far down the rabbit hole with these guys, but you can see I now have something called drum rack. I can press Command R to rename that, and I could call that rim shots, like that. I can right-click and I can color code in order to stay organized, especially when I'm using the Push controller, which is color responsive. I really find it valuable to color code things. And then I have the 2 individual rim shots. They play like normal, except they're inside a drum rack. And the beautiful thing about that is I can now apply effects specifically just to those instead of on the entire drum rack. So if I wanted to apply, say, a overdrive effect just to the rim shots, then what I could do is click it, drag it, and you can see there are different tabs at the end. So if I put it here outside the final tab, that's going to be on the entire drum rack. I don't want that. I'm going to put it inside one tab, and that is going to put it on the actual drum rack that contains both of the rim shots. Now, if I put it one position to the left, then it's just going to be on slice 11, this one simpler. So you have to be very careful with where you place things, but once you start to learn the setup, it's actually going to be really easy. So if I want to process this overdrive onto the 2 rim shots in the drum rack that's nested, I would place it right there. Okay, I'm going to undo what I just did there so I can leave those rim shots right where they were. And you can see that I've got the hats grouped and I've got the kicks grouped. And again, that is because I'm going to be applying specific processing that's going to go on all of those slices. Great, so now we're going to move into the next track down because that's where I'm going to show you all the processing that I've added. So we're going to select this processed track and we will solo it. I'll just play the drum loop first so you can hear what everything sounds like with all the processing added. Now I've added a processing chain to the kicks, to the heavy rim shot from the snare, to the hats, and then to the bus as a whole. So let's listen to how everything sounds together. And I'll A/B back and forth between the slice to MIDI loop with no processing and this one. Okay, so you can hear a significant difference between the two. There's a lot more weight and punch. Now let's get into exactly what I did to each one of the drums and the bus as a whole. First things first, I'm going to turn off the rack that I have processing the entire drum bus so we can solo up each one of the individual pieces. Let's start with the hi-hats. So because I have them all grouped together in the nested drum rack, I can just press solo and I can hear just the hi-hats. Okay. So what you can hear is I've got an EQ8 and I'm just rolling out all of the low end before or below 240 hertz. And then I have this preset from the overdrive device that I really, really like on top end. So if you go to overdrive, you'll just see there is this one called enhance. And this is the default preset. What it does is it rolls the bandpass filter up nice and high. You have drive tone, you have just a little bit of wet dry, and it just adds some sparkle, kind of like an exciter to the top end. So let's go ahead and just take those off and put them back on. Now you're hearing a little bit of popping and clicking at the end, and you might be thinking, why didn't we trim that out? And actually, when I did that with this loop, it actually lost a bit of the original character. And so it's kind of got this particular sound to it where the clicks and pops at the end, when you hear the whole thing playing together, you actually don't notice them. So on some of the drum slices, I actually left clicks at the end intentionally. So that's what you're hearing in there. So don't be alarmed and think that that was something that we should have removed. In this case, with this loop, I actually liked the sound of those in there. Let's bounce to our next drum here, and we're going to go down to the heavy rim shot. Let's first find where that is in the track. This is hitting on the 2 and the 4, and I wanted to process this one and have it be the main snare in the loop. So let's check out how it sounds. And again, I'm using that handy shortcut, the Option plus spacebar, to just play the highlighted region. That would be Alt and spacebar on PC. So let's take a look at the actual effects. You can see here I'm using an instance of drum bus and an instance of Corpus. Now, Corpus is an especially useful and powerful tool for drums. It does some really, really neat stuff, filtering, tuning, simulating membranes. It's deadly. I'm not going to go super deep into it because what I'm using is actually a preset. So if we go over to Corpus, you can see that there is one called Punchy Snare right here. And if I load it next to it, you'll see that what I have changed actually is just the tuning. So by default, it loads at 261.63, which is C3. And because my track is in the key of G, and that's where I want my snare fundamental to be hitting, and I've actually tuned it there, I have typed in 196, which is G2. So let's go ahead and listen to the difference between Corpus with the Punchy Snare preset. Here's without and with. So it's definitely adding a lot to the sound. I really, really like the sound of Corpus, and I use it on a lot of my drums. You're going to see it further in the tutorial as well. The next thing we've got in the chain of effects is drum bus. Now you might be thinking to yourself, isn't drum bus just for a bus of drums, as the name would imply? And in fact, the Ableton manual itself says that it's for processing groups of drums, but there's nothing that says that you can't use drum bus on individual drums. So what I'm doing with drum bus here is using it to target in and process the transients. So I'm using the section right here and I'm turning the transients down to negative 0.25. Now, normally what you'd see is this creating an impact from a transient shaper by increasing the attack and possibly the sustain. And what this does with drum bus is does that. It increases the attack and the sustain. But if you use a negative value, it actually does something interesting. It doesn't reduce the attack phase like you would expect. It actually increases the attack phase without increasing the sustain phase of the drum. So it gives you more impact on the front end and keeps the whole drum a little tighter and punchier without making it sound overcompressed. So here it is without and with. And let's listen to the difference between a positive and a negative value. You can hear the whole body of the snare is being accentuated and raised, which gives it an overcompressed feel. And if you drop it down, it just gives it a nice snappy feel. And because I'm adding compression further down the chain, I don't want to overcompress the snare here and flatten out the dynamics in it. Now, the other thing I'm also using is just targeting the frequency in here of the enhancement at a G as well. So again, drum bus without it. All right, that's our snare. Time to move on to the kicks. So let's go ahead and solo up the kicks, and we will just highlight the very first one. And there's only one effect that I've got on the kick, and it is another instance of Corpus using a different preset. This time I'm using one called Kick Tight, which you can find right up here. Let's go ahead and drag a default instance of Kick Tight. And you'll see similarly, I've used the tuning, and instead of using its default tuning of 47.02, I've adjusted it to the fundamental frequency of my kick, which is a G0 at 49 Hertz. So let's listen to it without and with. So it's adding in a ton of body to the bottom of the kick. And really, I found the original kick from the loop was too light and too thin sounding. So Corpus really helps to fill this out. Corpus is something that I really would love for you guys to get to know and to begin using on all of your drums. The final thing I'll just mention is that it's 50% in the mix. Let's jack that up to 100. That to me sounded a little pushed. It sounded a little too resonant. You can really hear the actual resonation happening. And 50% in the mix was a sweet spot for me. Yeah. All right, that is our drums, everybody. Now we're gonna move on from the individual sounds, the individual kit pieces, onto the processing that I put on the entire drum bus. So if you go over here to the end of the rack, you'll see I've got a second audio effect rack, and that contains a whole series of effects over here. So I've got the rack turned off. Let's turn the rack on and we'll listen to it with and without. Okay, so I want you guys to be able to hear each one of the individual effects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to multi-select and highlight them. I'm going to press the 0 key, which toggles all of them on and off at the same time. And I'm going to go through and activate one at a time, go through what I've done. So Corpus, big time, awesome effect. I've taken another preset here called Loop Move. You can find that under the loop section, Loop Move right here. Let's turn that on. Now, by default, it has the wet dry all the way up. So check this out. Super, super mangly, crazy, way too much. I really liked that just mixed in a little bit, and I found it was adding in just some beautiful top end, really kind of targeting the hi-hats. Sweet. Yeah, next up we've got drum bus. Now this is drum bus using it the way that drum bus is intended to be used, and there's some heavy processing happening here. Here it is without. You can hear it's just being the monster that it is, and it's crushing things. So let's go through step by step what I'm actually doing with drum bus. First thing I'm doing is using the drive with the soft option. So I'm just adding in some distortion and saturation to the signal. Next thing you can see, I'm pushing the transients. So in this case, I'm giving it a positive value. Unlike the snare rim shot that we saw where it was a negative value, this is actually adding to the attack phase, and it's also adding to the sustain phase. So giving it a compressed feel. You can see finally I'm using the boom parameter, and that is targeting the 49 hertz, which is the fundamental of the kick. It's the bottom end, and that's adding in that beautiful sub resonance on the bottom of the drums and helping them to feel super, super beefy. So I'm going to turn these all down, and we're going to add them in individually. Awesome. Drum bus is just a total monster. I'm going to be using it on a lot of stuff, and it's what's providing the beef and the main substantial part of the processing here in this rack. Okay, next up we've got a utility. Super easy. All I'm doing with the utility is I'm using the bass mono. So that's putting anything under 120 hertz into mono, and I'm just gain staging it down by 6 dB. And that's just helping my ears as a mix engineer to be able to make a judgment, because drum bus is adding so much loudness that I want utility to compensate for that a little bit. And the reason why I didn't use the output on drum bus is because I wanted to actually put the bottom end into mono at the same time. Sweet. All right, last but not least, our final effect is a reverb. And earlier in the tutorial, you saw me use the gate device to be able to remove room sound and ambience. And the reason why I did that is because all of this other processing that we're doing would have been applied over top of the natural reverb tails and decays of the original drums. And it would have made it sound really unnatural. It would have made it sound really overcompressed. It would have made the entire drum loop really muddy sounding, especially when you start using Corpus and drum bus and drive and things like that. So I removed the natural ambience, I tightened everything else up, and then I'm adding my own controlled ambience that I'm in charge of and one final sheen layer to it. And I'm using a really controlled reverb. So one of the things that I do with reverbs is I use the low cut and the high cut to band pass things in. It really helps the reverb to blend in with the drums and doesn't muddy up the bottom end or clutter the top end. I'm using a pre-delay of 13 milliseconds, and that's actually a rhythmic value of the song. A previous tutorial I did was all about BPM synced reverbs. You guys should check that out. It goes into detail about how I made those calculations, and I've got a spreadsheet that will help you do that. And then we've got a decay time of 416 milliseconds. So this is a really tight reverb. This is kind of a drum room feel. You can see I've turned the size down to 10, and I've only got a little tiny bit of wet dry here. So let's go ahead and listen without and listen with. So there you have it, my entire workflow on pitching, slicing, bussing, and processing drums in Ableton Live. If you got something out of this video, drop it a like and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. If you have any questions at all, just hit me in the comments and I'd love to hear from you. And come pay us a visit at Warp Academy. We teach everything related to music production in Ableton Live, as well as sound design, with courses from Ableton Live certified trainers so that you know you're getting the legit knowledge straight from the source from people you can trust. Right now, we have a free course called Warp 10, which is about how to get the most out of all the new features in Ableton Live 10. Click the link, come grab it, it's yours. That's all I've got for you today, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in and watching. I'll catch you real soon. Much love. Cheers.